The night was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel like a scream. It was around 11 o'clock when the last train had already passed, leaving the railway station deserted and dimly lit by a few flickering yellow bulbs. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of rust and damp iron. Somewhere in the corner of the platform, a man lay wrapped tightly in an old white cloth, sleeping on the stone floor like a forgotten shadow. He had been there for hours. No one knew who he was, where he came from, or why he was sleeping there. The few passengers who occasionally passed by whispered among themselves, but kept their distance. There was something strange about the way he slept, too still, too silent, almost as if he was trying to hide from something that couldn't be seen. Then, without warning, the stillness shattered. The man began to tremble, first lightly, then violently. His body jerked and twisted, the white cloth tightening around him as though it was alive and trying to strangle him. A low, choking sound escaped his throat. People nearby rushed closer, confused and horrified. "Hey, what's happening to him?" someone shouted. But before anyone could help, the man let out a piercing scream, one that echoed across the empty station and bounced off the iron roofs like a curse. His body arched upward, then collapsed back to the ground completely still. His hands were frozen mid-air, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Someone slowly pulled the cloth away from his face. The moment they did, several people gasped and stepped back. His eyes were gone, not closed, not hidden, just gone. In their place were two dark, hollow sockets, bleeding from the edges, as if something had burned right through them. The smell of iron filled the air. One of the onlookers began to tremble. Another vomited on the platform. The railway guard, pale and shaking, blew his whistle again and again, calling for help. Within minutes, a few police officers arrived with flashlights, their boots echoing ominously on the concrete floor. They examined the body in disbelief. One officer whispered, "What kind of death is this?" Another crossed himself and looked away. "Eyes don't just vanish," said the senior officer, voice unsteady. "This isn't normal. We'll have to send it for post-mortem tonight." As the officers lifted the body, the white cloth slipped, and a faint trail of black dust fell from his face. The youngest officer hesitated before touching it, because even though the wind was still, the dust moved on its own, spreading slowly across the platform like smoke from a dying fire. The corpse's mouth hung open, frozen in a silent scream. And as they carried him away, someone from the small crowd whispered, "I saw his eyes. They weren't gone at first. They disappeared after he died." A shiver rippled through everyone. No one spoke again. The train station fell silent once more, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, watching, waiting, because something unnatural had awakened that night. Something that had taken a man's eyes and left its mark behind. The ambulance reached the district morgue close to midnight. The place stood behind the old hospital building, isolated, surrounded by half-dead trees and a fence that creaked in the wind. The flickering sodium light at the entrance buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the suffocating stillness. Inside, the air was cold and stale, a mixture of disinfectant, blood, and something older, something rotten. The walls were stained with years of forgotten deaths. That night, only one man was on duty, Dr. Alan Morrison, the senior forensic officer. He had performed hundreds of autopsies in his career, burn victims, drownings, murders. Nothing could shake him anymore. To him, death was just another routine, another quiet puzzle waiting to be solved under bright, merciless lights. When the body from the station was brought in, Alan sighed. "Another one," he muttered, signing the paper the police handed him. "Unidentified. Eyes missing. Unnatural cause." The officers didn't stay long. None of them wanted to linger in the morgue that night. Before leaving, one of them said in a low voice, "Sir, be careful. The way he died, it wasn't normal." Alan gave a faint smile, the kind that hides discomfort. "Don't worry, the dead can't hurt you." He had no idea how wrong he was. The moment he unwrapped the body, a wave of cold air rolled across the room. The lights flickered, then steadied. The corpse lay on the steel table, the same hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Alan leaned closer, shining his lamp into them. The flesh was dark, blackened, as if something had burned deep from inside the skull. He frowned. "Not possible," he whispered, adjusting his gloves. As he prepared his instruments, the silence grew heavier. The steady tick of the wall clock seemed to echo too loudly. The air conditioner hummed irregularly, making short, choking noises like it was gasping for air. He began cutting carefully along the chest. The scalpel slid easily, but suddenly, his hand twitched. It felt like someone had grabbed his wrist. He froze. The room was still. Slowly, he looked down. The corpse's hand, the one lying by its side just moments ago, was clutching his wrist. Alan's breath caught in his throat. The grip was ice cold yet strong. Fingernails digging into his glove, drawing blood beneath it. He yanked his arm free, stumbling backward, knocking over a tray of metal tools. The sound clattered through the moor. The corpse lay still again, motionless, silent. Alan stared at it, heart pounding. His wrist was bleeding. The glove had torn, where something nails had scratched through the skin. He pressed a tissue to the wound, whispering to himself, "It's just nerves, reflex movement, muscular contraction after death. That's all." But when he turned, something made him stop. The corpse's fingers were still curled, sticky with fresh blood. His blood. Panicked, Alan ran to the door, flung it open. Two police officers who had stayed nearby rushed in, startled by the sound. "What happened?" one asked. Alan pointed at the table, his voice trembling. "It grabbed me. The body grabbed me." The officers exchanged confused looks, trying not to laugh. "Sir, are you sure? Maybe you imagined." "Look," Alan shouted, pulling off his glove. Blood trickled down his palm. It left marks. "See these scratches?" Their smiles faded. The older officer slowly approached the corpse. Under his flashlight, they saw it clearly. Thin streaks of blood on the dead man's fingernails. He swallowed hard. "That's impossible." The other officer backed away, muttering prayers under his breath. Alan sat in the corner, shaking, while the officers stood by the door, too afraid to come closer. The room had grown colder, breath visible in the air. Somewhere inside the walls, something made a soft scratching noise, faint but constant. It was as if the morgue itself was alive, whispering. Alan looked at the corpse again. Its mouth was open now. He hadn't left it that way. The jaw hung slightly to one side, as if it was smiling. He grabbed his scalpel and forced himself to continue. The police refused to leave, staying inside the room just in case. Every second felt heavier. Every incision felt wrong, unnatural, as though he wasn't cutting flesh, but something that refused to die. When the procedure was finally over, Alan stepped away, drenched in sweat. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. "Bury him," he whispered hoarsely. "Now, I don't want him here another second." The police nodded, almost relieved to be given an excuse to leave. They wrapped the corpse again in its stained white cloth, but as they covered its face, Alan swore he saw the hollows where the eyes should have been blinked. Just once, like a dying ember flickering back to life. That night, the body was labeled as unclaimed, cause of death, unknown. They buried him the next morning in a quiet corner of the town graveyard. But the grave didn't stay quiet for long, because something inside that white cloth had not stopped moving. The next morning came, gray and heavy. A thin mist had spread over the cemetery like a sheet of faded smoke. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, the lingering scent of last night's fear. The police truck stopped at the edge of the graveyard. Two constables stepped out, both silent, both pale. They carried the body, still wrapped in its blood-stained white cloth, the same one it had worn since death. There was no coffin, no prayer, no name. Only a tag that read, "Unidentified male case number 17. The gravedigger, an old man named Henry, waited beside the open grave. His shovel stood buried in the ground, and his cigarette burned to ash between his fingers. When he saw the body, he hesitated. "Who's this one?" he asked. "Doesn't matter," said the younger officer. "No family, no claim. Just bury it and sign the register." Henry nodded slowly, but his eyes never left the covered shape on the stretcher. "Something wrong with it?" the older officer muttered. Don't ask." He turned away as the gravedigger lowered the body into the hole. The cloth fluttered once in the wind before it touched the dirt. For a brief second, the younger constable swore he saw it move from inside, as though a breath escaped from beneath it, but he didn't say anything. He just wanted to leave. The first shovelful of soil fell onto the white cloth with a dull, heavy sound. Thud. Then another, and another. The sound echoed through the quiet cemetery like a heartbeat. When the grave was finally covered, Henry wiped the sweat from his forehead and lit another cigarette. "All done," he said softly, but his voice didn't sound sure. He leaned on his shovel for a moment. That's when he noticed that the ground where the grave had just been filled seemed to sink slightly, like something beneath the soil had shifted. He frowned. "Loose ground," he told himself, but the feeling in his chest disagreed. That night, the wind picked up. The cemetery stood alone on the edge of town, surrounded by fields and the whispering rustle of dead grass. The moonlight was thin and ghostly, and somewhere among the graves, a soft, rhythmic sound began, like something gently tapping from underground. Thud, thud, thud. At first, the night guard thought it was just branches hitting a fence, but when he walked closer, the sound stopped only to start again, behind him. He turned his flashlight around. Nothing, only rows of gravestones stretching into darkness. Then, from the far corner, came a whisper, a faint, broken voice. It didn't sound human. Cold. The guard froze. "Who's there?" The voice came again. Closer now. Cold. So cold. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely. In the blackness, he heard something dragging across the gravel path. Something heavy, slow, and when the wind blew, it carried a smell he would never forget. The smell of rotting flesh and wet soil. The next morning, they found the night guard lying unconscious near the gate. His eyes were wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. When they woke him, he kept repeating one sentence over and over. The cloth was moving. The cloth was moving. By the third night, the people living near the cemetery began to notice strange things. Dogs barked endlessly at the same empty corner of the graveyard. Birds stopped nesting in the nearby trees. The air around that one grave was colder, so cold that even in daylight, a thin fog curled up from the soil. The old gravedigger, Henry, refused to go near it anymore. "There's something wrong down there," he told the priest. "Something that doesn't want to stay buried." One evening, Henry stood at his small shack near the cemetery fence. The sun had just set, and the light was fading fast. Out of habit, he glanced toward the graves, and froze. The earth above the new grave was moving. Not from wind, not from rain. It was breathing. The ground pulsed slowly, rising and falling like something beneath it was alive and trying to come out. Henry stumbled backward, heart hammering. He ran to the police outpost, shouting, "You have to come. The dead one's not staying dead." But by the time they returned with lanterns and flashlights, the grave looked perfectly still again. Only the faint scent of burned flesh lingered in the air. At the hospital morgue, Dr. Alan Morrison hadn't slept since that night. His bandaged wrist still throbbed, and sometimes, he swore he could feel cold fingers brushing against it when no one was there. He tried to dismiss it as stress, but every time he looked in the mirror, he saw faint bruises. Finger marks appeared just beneath the bandage. That evening, as he drove past the cemetery on his way home, his headlights briefly caught something white moving between the gravestones. He slowed the car. It looked like a person, bent and shuffling slowly across the graveyard, wrapped in a long white cloth. The exact same one. For a long second, the figure stopped and turned toward the road. Even through the mist, Alan could see it clearly. A face without eyes, staring directly at him. He slammed the accelerator and sped away, but in his rearview mirror, he saw it still standing there, half in shadow, half in moonlight, the wind gently lifting the edges of its burial shroud. And though the car engine roared, he could still hear it whisper, "Cold." That was the night Dr. Alan Morrison realized the dead man hadn't stayed in his grave. And it was only the beginning. For 3 nights straight, Dr. Alan Morrison couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that face. That eyeless, hollow face, wrapped in a dirty white shroud, standing beneath the trees near the cemetery, staring at him through darkness that felt alive. He kept telling himself it was just guilt, or exhaustion, or the brain trying to make sense of what it didn't understand. But deep down, a small voice whispered the truth: the dead man had found him. The fourth night came cold and moonless. The city slept, but Alan couldn't. He sat in his chair, the clock ticking louder than it ever had before. His house was silent, except for the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The lights flickered once, then again. He stood, nervous, and looked out through the living room window. The street was empty, silent, and washed in pale streetlight. Nothing moved. But then, from the corner of his vision, he saw something white slip behind the large tree across the road. He froze. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then he grabbed his torch and stepped outside. The night air bit through his skin, carrying with it the smell of wet soil. His shoes crunched on the gravel as he slowly approached the tree. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. No answer. He circled around the trunk and found nothing. Just the empty road. The whisper of wind. He was about to turn back when something cold brushed against his neck. He spun around again. Nothing. But when he looked down, he saw muddy footprints behind him, leading from the gate all the way to his door. And they weren't his. The next morning, Alan looked pale, sleepless, and haunted. At the hospital, his assistant noticed the change. "You okay, sir? You look like you haven't closed your eyes in days." Alan forced a smile. "Just tired." But when he rolled up his sleeve to wash his hands, the assistant gasped. The skin around his wrist where the corpse had grabbed him had turned dark purple. The shape of fingers burned into the flesh. Alan covered it quickly. "Infection," he said softly, but his voice trembled. That evening, as he was leaving the hospital, he heard the echo of footsteps following him down the hallway. Slow, heavy steps. He turned, no one there. But every time he started walking, the steps followed again. He began walking faster. The sound behind him matched his pace. When he stopped, it stopped. When he ran, it ran. By the time he reached his car, sweat drenched his forehead. He slammed the door, locked it, and sat breathing hard. Then, in the rear view mirror, something moved. For a brief moment, he saw a white shape in the back seat, sitting perfectly still, wrapped, silent. He spun around, empty. Only the faint scent of damp soil lingered in the car. The next night, the haunting grew bolder. Alan lay in bed, lights off, staring at the ceiling. His wrist throbbed like fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Around him, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. His breath became visible in the air. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Inside the house. Slow, dragging steps across the floor. Coming from the hallway. Alan sat up, frozen. His heart hammered in his chest. The steps stopped outside his bedroom door. Then knock, knock, knock. He didn't move. The knocking grew louder. The handle turned slightly, creaking, though he hadn't touched it. "Who's there?" he whispered. The door opened halfway. A cold draft filled the room. And in that doorway, half in shadow, stood a figure wrapped in the same white burial cloth. It tilted its head slowly, as if studying him. The fabric moved slightly, breathing though there was no sound. Alan couldn't move. He couldn't even scream. The figure stepped closer, one step, then another. The light from the street lamp outside slipped through the curtain and fell across its face, revealing empty eye sockets, black and endless. Alan stumbled back, grabbing the lamp and throwing it at the thing. The light shattered, the figure vanished. Only silence remained. He stood trembling, gasping for air, when something whispered from behind him, close to his ear, like a voice speaking from inside his own skull. "You buried me wrong." Alan screamed and collapsed onto the floor. When he woke, it was morning. The door was wide open. The floor was muddy, as if someone had walked in and left wet footprints everywhere. Days passed. The haunting never stopped. Every night, the figure returned, sometimes in his dreams, sometimes when he was awake. Sometimes it stood at the end of his bed. Sometimes it sat in the corner of his room, unmoving, watching. And sometimes, he would wake up and find the white cloth lying beside him on the floor, soaked in dirt and blood. He stopped eating, stopped going to work. His voice trembled when he spoke. His eyes grew sunken. He knew he was losing his mind, but deep down, he also knew it wasn't madness. It was real. One night, driven by desperation, he finally spoke to it. He sat on his bed, shaking, the air cold enough to see his breath. "What do you want from me?" he whispered into the darkness. At first, nothing. Then a voice from the corner, a deep, hollow echo, the sound of earth shifting under a grave. "Move me, not here. Move me again." Alan's eyes widened. "Move you? You mean the grave?" The voice hissed, closer now, as if standing right beside him. "They buried me wrong. My head, missing. Bring me peace." The lights went out. For the first time, Alan saw it clearly, standing inches from his face. The eyeless sockets were weeping thick black blood that dripped onto the floor. Its mouth stretched open wider than any human mouth should, whispering again and again, "Move me, move me, move me." Alan screamed, the sound breaking through the walls of his home. When the neighbors rushed in the next morning, they found him lying unconscious on the floor, his body cold as ice. But what terrified them most were the footprints, muddy, bare, and leading out of the house. And on the window, written in a finger smeared with black blood, were two words, "Not done." That was when Alan realized there would be no escape. Not until he went back. Not until he found the missing head. Because the dead do not rest when they've been buried incomplete. The rain came down in thin, icy needles that night. It soaked the crooked headstones and turned the cemetery soil into black mud. Every flash of lightning illuminated the graves for a heartbeat, then plunged them back into darkness. Dr. Alan Morrison stood at the iron gate, soaked to the skin, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. He hadn't slept for days. He hadn't eaten, but the whisper still haunted his head, over and over. "Move me, my head, missing." He had tried to ignore it. He had tried pills, prayers, even fire, but nothing silenced the voice. Every night, the figure appeared closer than before until finally, whispered, "Come to me." So here he was, back at the grave. The grave looked different now. The earth above it was cracked, breathing steam in the cold air. A faint odor, sweet, foul, and unmistakable, rose from below. Two police officers had agreed to meet him there, both uneasy, but too superstitious to say no. Henry, the old gravedigger, came along too, holding his shovel like a crucifix. "You sure about this, Doc?" Henry asked, voice thin against the wind. "The dead don't like to be disturbed." Alan's eyes were hollow. "He's not resting. We have to know why." Lightning flashed again, and for a moment, the whole graveyard seemed alive. Shadows writhing between the stones, shapes moving where there should have been none. "Let's get it over with," one officer said, his voice shaking. The first shovel broke the soil with a wet thunk. Mud splattered. The sound echoed like a heartbeat. Thud, thud, thud. With every layer of dirt they removed, the stench grew thicker, a choking mixture of decay and something chemical, something burned. Then Henry's shovel hit wood, a hollow, empty sound. He froze. "That's it." Alan knelt, scraping the mud away with his bare hands, until the edges of the coffin appeared old, black, and swollen with water. "Open it," he said. The officers hesitated. "Sir, we can't just open it." Reluctantly, Henry wedged the crowbar beneath the lid and pried it open. The hinges screamed like metal animals. Inside lay the body, still wrapped in its white shroud, but smaller somehow, shriveled, as though time itself had eaten away at it. The fabric clung to the bones, soaked in black moisture. Alan reached out and peeled the cloth back. The moment the face was exposed, everyone gasped. The head was gone. Only the stump of a neck remained, jagged and dark as if burned. The rest of the body was intact. Hands, ribs, legs, but where the skull should have been was only emptiness, a nest of worms glistening under the flashlight. Henry stumbled backward, crossing himself again and again. One of the officers whispered, "Oh God, have mercy." Alan just stared, mouth dry, eyes wide. "It's true," he murmured. "He told me the truth." Lightning struck nearby, and for a split second, the corpse seemed to move, the chest rising faintly, as though it had taken a breath. The ground began to tremble. At first, it was just the thunder, they thought. Then the coffin shifted. Mud cracked open around it, spilling black water that smelled of rot and ashes. "Step back," the officer shouted, but it was too late. The white cloth, the same one that had once wrapped the corpse, rose from the coffin like a snake, twisting in the rain. It lashed toward them, wrapping around Alan's arm. He screamed as the fabric burned against his skin, the mark of those same 5 fingers appearing beneath it. Henry dropped his shovel and ran. One officer fell trying to escape, his boots sinking into the mud. The wind howled like 1,000 voices crying from underground. Alan tried to pull free, shouting, "What do you want from me?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A deep, rumbling growl that turned into a whisper right next to his ear. "Bring it back. The head. They took it from me." "Who took it?" Alan screamed. The lightning flashed again, and in that blinding white light, he saw them. At the far edge of the graveyard, half hidden by trees, stood 3 figures in black robes, their faces covered, their hands clutching something that glowed faintly red. Something round. The missing head. Alan stumbled toward them, but the ground gave way beneath his feet. The grave swallowed him waist deep, the mud gripping him like cold hands. The robed figures turned and vanished into the darkness, taking the head with them. The glow faded, and the whisper changed. Too late. The wind died. The cloth fell limp, sinking back into the coffin. When the officers pulled Alan free, his face was pale, his pulse weak. His eyes stared blankly at the open grave. "Close it," he whispered. "Now, before it comes back." They buried the coffin again in silence. But as they shoveled the last mound of dirt, one officer noticed something shining in the mud. A small black charm carved with strange symbols. Alan picked it up. The charm pulsed faintly in his hand, warm despite the cold rain. He turned it over and saw something etched into the back. A circle, a flame, and a single word burned into the metal. "Exchange." He looked at Henry. "This wasn't just a burial," he said quietly. "It was a ritual." That night, back at home, Alan locked every door and sat by the fire. The charm still lay in his hand, heavy, unnatural. Outside, the storm raged. Then, just as he began to drift into half-sleep, the fire flickered and a drop of black liquid fell onto the floor beside him. He looked up. On the ceiling, upside down, like a shadow clinging to the plaster, hung the same figure in white, its neck torn open, black blood dripping slowly to the floor. Alan screamed. The figure turned its hollow sockets toward him and whispered, "Find my head, or lose yours." When neighbors forced the door open the next morning, they found Dr. Morrison lying unconscious on the floor, his hair turned completely white. On the wall behind him, in ash, were 4 words. "It has only begun." The night after the grave was reopened, Dr. Alan Morrison couldn't sleep. He had seen too much. The corpse's missing head, the strange black marks on the coffin, and that whisper, the same whisper he had been hearing in his dreams. You can't bury what's already awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that eyeless face staring right into his mind. The wind outside howled through the half-open window, carrying with it the faint smell of wet soil and decay. Alan got up and poured himself some water, but when he looked at the glass, the reflection staring back at him had no eyes. He dropped it immediately. The glass shattered, spilling water across the floor. Only, wasn't water anymore. It was black, thick, moving. He stepped back in terror, and then, someone knocked at the door. Once, twice, thrice. Slow, heavy, hollow. Alan's voice trembled. "Who's there?" No answer, only the sound of something dragging outside the door, like a body being pulled along the floor. His hands shook as he opened it. There was no one, but on the ground lay a piece of white cloth, torn and soaked with mud. The same cloth that had covered the dead man at the railway station. Alan froze. The air around him grew colder. The bulbs flickered. Then, at the far end of the corridor, someone was standing, wrapped in white, still, watching. "Who are you?" Alan shouted. The figure didn't move until suddenly, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Then, with a jerking motion, it started walking toward him, each step echoing like thunder. Alan ran back inside, slammed the door, locked it, but he could still hear the dragging sound getting closer, until it stopped right outside. Then came the whisper, "You touched what was sealed. Now, you'll see what I saw." The lights went out. In the dark, Alan heard a wet sound like fingers brushing against glass. He turned toward the window. 2 black holes stared at him through the glass. Deep, hollow, endless. He screamed and stumbled backward. The window shattered, and the figure crawled through, not walking, but pulling itself forward, its hands leaving trails of black blood. It was the same man, the same corpse. Only now, his face was clearer, and the 2 dark holes where his eyes should have been were weeping thick blood that dripped down onto the floor. Alan fell to his knees, shaking violently. "What do you want from me?" The corpse's mouth opened slowly, unnaturally wide, and from inside that mouth came the voice, the same one he had heard during the postmortem. "You took me from my grave. Now take my place." Alan screamed, but the thing lunged forward, grabbing his face with both cold hands. Its fingers dug into his skin, and in a flash of burning pain, Alan's eyes burst into darkness. He felt the blood flow, the cold rush of something crawling inside his head. Then silence. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Alan's room destroyed, the table overturned, the walls covered in black fingerprints, and on the bed lay a body wrapped in a white cloth, face covered, silent. When they lifted the cloth, the corpse's eyes were missing. In its right hand was a rusty scalpel, and on the wall, written in blood, were 4 words. "It was my turn." Outside, near the cemetery, a gravedigger swore he saw someone standing in the fog, a man in a white cloth, watching the grave silently, and when he looked closer, the man had no eyes. The end. Like, share, and subscribe please.